Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. This episode of Acton Line was recorded at Acton University, our flagship conference. Acton University is a 4-day exploration of theology, philosophy, entrepreneurship, international development, and market-based economics. Each day is filled with thought-provoking presentations on the intellectual and practical foundations of a free society. At Acton University, you can sharpen your intellect, expand your worldview, and learn the foundations of genuine human flourishing. To learn more, visit university.acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Anne Bradley. Anne is the George and Sally Mayer Fellow for Economic Education and Vice President of Academic Affairs at the Fund for American Studies. In addition to her role as a Fellow and Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Bradley teaches economics courses at George Mason University. She is an economics professor at the Institute for World Politics and an affiliate scholar here at the Acton Institute. Anne, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Dan. It's fun to be here.
Thank you. I got the idea. You wrote an outstanding review of what's turning into like a very important book in sort of like for discussion in sort of like American politics for Religion and Liberty Online at the beginning of June of this year, 2025. And it was a review of Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance. Could you give us, first, just sort of orient us, what is this? What is the main sort of thrust of the argument for this book?
Sure. So they're journalists, and they identify as people that are on the left ideologically. And so it is a book written to people on the left, advancing an abundance agenda. That is the short of it.
Yeah.
And they break the book into a variety of chapters to talk about different aspects where the left has gone wrong and what the left can do about it. So it's interesting, when I was reading it, it is certainly not kind of evangelism, right? I don't think they're trying to get people to become progressives or members of the left. And I don't think that they're trying to say either that progressives have gotten it so wrong that we should be conservative. So they're not making that case either, but rather, let's be pro-abundance because abundance is really good for everybody, including the poorest. Yeah.
And we're talking about abundance in terms of particularly housing, education, healthcare.
That's right.
Wages, economic growth, being just pro-economic growth in general. What did you make of their case for these things? I mean, this is divided along a couple of different sort of policy tracks in the book. Did you find them to be pointing to like real problems, I guess is where to start?
That's a great question. So sometimes and often I would say I did.
Yeah.
They start with kind of a vignette about life, I don't remember, like 2050 or something. And they say, imagine this. And then they talk about a world that has a lot of green energy, a world where you can eat plant-based meat, a world where pharmaceuticals just are dropped off on your front porch by a drone, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. The water you drink is local. It's piped in a different way, all this type of stuff. And so they start, and I think that's very helpful because you get their vision of what abundance looks like. And the book is arguments about how to capture that vision. And so there were parts where I felt like it was a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
And there were highs, and I'm like, yes, I'm so with you. And then there were parts where I'm like, nope, not with you. And so we'll get to this maybe later. But at the end is where I think they really show who they are. And they bring up Marx and they say, there's like some redemption here about what capitalism kind of does to all of this stuff and then how to kind of mitigate it. So I don't think they're advocating, they're not like true Marxists where they're saying, forget property rights and forget markets. But I think they see them as out of control. And they say that more than one time in the book is they're worried about right regulations. So it's not also a book of like, let's do away with regulations. Yet they do argue that unintentionally, or it's a story of unintended consequences, right? These regulations, especially in housing, which they say, kind of this started in the 70s, really has made housing unaffordable. And they argue that something like homelessness populations in major cities like San Francisco, people are homeless because they don't have housing. Now, we might say there's more to homelessness than that, but I certainly agree with them that this is a huge part of the problem. If people can't afford a place to live and they don't have the means to move, then homelessness is certainly related to skyrocketing housing costs and the inability to afford housing or shelter of some kind.
So there's this sort of solar punk future that they envision. I think there's a yogurt commercial, I forget which brand, that actually like does this, where they're like people out picking fruit with like robot helpers that are also and they're hand washing the clothes, but it's like with robot help and everything's solar powered. But the thing that's preventing that is not regulation, but bad regulation. And what we need is the good regulation, and then this unleashes the abundant future. What's an example of like a bad regulation that they point to and what the good regulation might be? If it's not a deregulation sort of thing.
They make a lot of arguments. I'll generally answer and try to get to specifics as well. They generally, I think, are talking about state capacity, right? So they're kind of making this argument that the state has the power and the means and the ability to make sure that, A, we're not leaving like pharmaceutical development to the unfettered market. That is not what they want, and they say as much. But that, and with housing, I don't think they would say just do away with all the regulations, but that, they talk about, and they actually talk that this started in San Francisco, which is this NIMBY movement, not in my backyard, right? That they point to that as it's this grassroots, you're not going to do this in my community. So intergenerational living, multi-dwelling complexes. They talk about the elimination of boarding houses, which is so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because in my lifetime, I haven't known a boarding house or where one is. I think there's one boarding house left in D.C. for Christian women.
It is,
and it's been there for quite some time,
yeah.
right? So at the Institute of World Politics where I teach, one of our young interns lived there. And I said, tell me all about this, so I just didn't even know it was in my backyard, essentially. So they've just been regulated out of existence. But the benefit of a boarding house is, again, what we're talking about. If you're in transition, if you are low income, if you don't have enough money for a down payment, if you have bad credit. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons people may or may not be able to afford not only a home, but just an apartment, that a boarding house is a way to provide people with what they need in the way that they need it at a price they can afford. So that's a great example of the NIMBY movement erecting local regulations. So I think that's the other part, is that in some cases, what they're talking about is not some grand federal set of regulations that was kind of like dropped down on all of us, but that these have been emerging over time in various ways: zoning, licenses, zoning, land size regulations, land use regulations, commingling residential and commercial, that we've decided that we're going to plan cities in a way that we make them unaffordable.
Mm-hmm. For listeners, boarding houses, what distinguishes them is that they do not, each room does not have a bathroom, and there's a shared common bath and shower facility, at the end of the hall.
Kind of like a dorm.
Like a dorm.
Maybe not modern dorms, but when I went to college, those were the dorms.
That was what they were like when I was there too,
Yeah.
which was now a long time ago. But So they're looking at these sort of like micro regulations where it's really, I mean, so the paradox of these is these are often like very democratic, like they come out of like community meetings that, people want to preserve property values or the character of the neighborhood, or, they just don't want to see change in general. They kind of want to freeze this into a time capsule. If you remember, like the house in Full House in San Francisco.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Like those houses still exist in San Francisco, despite like the fact that it's just a staggering amount of value in that land for those to be for there to be those sort of single family residences in those neighborhoods. But the people who live in those neighborhoods, they'll fight tooth and nail to keep that.
Absolutely. You're right. It is a democratic process. It makes me think a lot of HOAs.
Yeah.
So there's a democratic nature to the HOA, but there's these pernicious sets of outcomes. Mm-hmm. So in some other research that I'm doing, and that's why I was just really struck by the book, but one of the things I look at is just the pernicious regulations against in-home daycares, to give you an example, right? So if you live in a neighborhood like I live in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., where there's a lot of wealthy people, our HOA has essentially regulated this away. And they basically do these kind of rules. You can't have so many cars in front of your, driveway at one time. And so the way this all starts is the neighbors are thinking, well, there's this lady, and I kind of figured out what she's doing. She's running a daycare. This happened on my street.
Yeah.
And people were coming in and out in the morning, and they were coming in and out in the evening, and they just tried to use the HOA to make her unable to provide an income for her family and a service for other people in the community, which they seem to want, right? So the only people that don't want this are the people that share the street with you. And so that's the kind of, they're talking about those types of phenomenons, but they're more often talking about regulations in terms of city level, state level regulations that are exacerbating these problems. And I think they're absolutely right that that has caused an increase in the price of housing, and they talk about all the social problems that result from that. So you read the first book. I think the first chapter is the best. The housing, and I think for free market people, like-minded, kind of people in that mindset, there's a lot to agree with in that book. I think as Christians, we might say, well, there's also something else going on, which is when people are suffering from addiction and they're living on the street. Yeah. A boarding house even might not solve their problems. Mm-hmm. Now, the boarding house might provide rules, and if you want to stay there, you have to adhere to the rules, and that may change your behavior. But there's a lot more to it than just materially, I can't afford a house, so I'm going to live on the street. So I think, the Christian perspective allows us to bring something in addition to what they're advocating for. But that was a part of the book I thought, this is great. It's so great to hear people on the left making the case for this.
So where is it? Where was one of those cringe moments that, you're cheering along with this moment? You're like, you know what? They don't quite get the whole picture, but I'm tracking with them.
Yeah.
I'm following their argument here. I think they're pointing to real problems, and they're pointing to, these sorts of regulations as being obstacles to creating housing abundance in these communities. Where is one part of this where you thought this is just not going to lead to the sort of abundance they're promising?
So I'm going to maybe give two examples. The first is where they kind of talk about medical innovation. And they're right that we need medical innovation. And, my argument on all of this is that the reason that we have less medical innovation than we otherwise would is not because there's a free market in pharmaceuticals and medical devices, right? It's actually the opposite story. So they're not there. Mm-hmm. They, as I've mentioned, they say multiple times in the book that we just cannot leave some things to the market. And I just disagree with that as an economist. I would say I think you'd get more lower cost, better pharmaceuticals over time if you remove some of these overly burdensome regulations, including the time and the amount of testing that's required to release a pharmaceutical drug. The other thing we see on the other side is that once a firm has a pharmaceutical patent, they fight tooth and nail in court. So that, in economics, we would call this unproductive entrepreneurship. This comes from William Baumol. So the idea is that then they start becoming rent seekers around that. I don't think they're where they need to, well, at least where I would agree with them on that. I think they understand that there's a problem, but I think they want to reorient the state in a way to kind of just make it better. So one example they use is deploying COVID vaccines and all the stuff, which it is true that we were able in the United States, one of the richest countries in the world, to deploy COVID vaccines extremely quickly. And we were able to give them to other countries, in fact, all these types of things. But that was because we removed obstacles that weren't working for us. And I wish they would pick up on that there and say, that's maybe a lesson for us as people on the left to say, there is, if you don't need those regulations in a pandemic, in a crisis, do you ever need them?
Yeah.
But they don't kind of really ask that question. And then the other thing is, at one point they talk about Medicare and Medicaid as innovations. And I think, no. I mean, these are both bankrupt, basically, programs, right? So
as fostering innovation?
Yeah, so just as an innovation in the way we help society get more health care and health insurance and health coverage. So to me, that's like saying like the TSA is a great innovation that's radicalized airline safety.
Yeah.
I think the TSA is a jobs program, right? I don't really actually see evidence that it makes us better off. Medicare and Medicaid are our biggest unfunded liabilities. So not only are they probably really bad ideas, but they are bankrupt ideas, right? So they're insolvent. And so we're going to have to now come up with something that replaces that. Or if we don't figure out how to finance it. So there's absolutely parts of the book where, again, that roller coaster ride, which made it so fascinating for me to read because I didn't know what was going to come next.
Yeah. So as you're explaining this is really interesting to me because I have not read the book yet. I've read your review. I've read a lot of reviews of this book. And some people have, given it a cheer as a movement in the right, some sort of libertarian conservative folks, market-oriented folks have given it a kind of, one thumbs up, if not two thumbs up. Some folks have given it two thumbs down. But what I see a lot in the left is there are a lot of people who are giving this two thumbs down and seem to think that this abundance agenda is like a Trojan horse to market fundamentalism or something like that. What do you make of these left-wing critics? Are they just not careful readers? I mean, you're frustrated all the time that they're constantly hedging and insisting on the necessity of regulation, even as they're pointing out how regulation has led to these terrible outcomes. But these other folks, are they just not reading it clearly? Or do you get the feeling that maybe Klein and Thompson are just putting in that language of, of course, we don't want an unregulated market. Is that just, an attempt to throw leftist critics potentially off the trail? Is there a Straussian reading of abundance where they're actually, more in favor of deregulation than they know they can say to sell it? Because the reaction from the far left has just been to savage this book and accuse these people of basically, holding up the Constitution of Liberty and, rebranding
We've converted
it
or
abundance.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I certainly haven't read all those reviews. So I'll just speak on basically what I think might be going on there, which is to say, I think that there's a lot of false beliefs on both, this is kind of the depressing part, both in contingents of the right and certainly more predictable contingents, right, of the left, that this kind of late stage capitalism or whatever it is, where if you believe that we're there, then the wheels are going to fall off and all of this bad stuff is going to happen and capitalism is very unstable, can't sustain itself, et cetera. So if I'm a far left person and I'm reading this, I can see them having the roller coaster that I had.
Yeah.
Which is, okay, they're first day capacity, so I'm with you on that. Let's have a technocratic approach to how we're going to cultivate abundance, which is my biggest problem with the whole thing. But they, the far left would love that. But then there is language of like the market does some stuff and it seems to be effective. And I think for progressives who this book is written to, it's a reflection on what they did wrong.
Yeah.
It's not damning in any way. I mean, they're writing, I think, compassionately. I think they're writing in a way that is not trying to blame the left, but trying to say, if we want this future that we just wrote about, this wonderful future, right, where we've reduced climate change, we're reducing inequality, we're increasing access, I think that appeals to the far left. But so maybe they do have to go out of their way to kind of diss the market more than one time. So it's very clear to me as you proceed through the book. And it's not till the very end that they bring up Marx. And, as soon as I start reading this, I'm like, oh my gosh, where are we going with this? And it's almost a question in my mind, why did you wait till the end? And, maybe that's for people like me to not stop reading.
Yeah. So let's talk about this Marxian turn at the end.
Yeah.
Or this bringing up of Marx at the end. How do they bring up Marx?
So they basically, sorry.
Go.
They basically kind of make this argument that while, they're not Marxists in the kind of like a Leninist kind of way, I didn't really say that, but, they're making that clear because I think they don't want to be discredited, right away. But they say, the thing is Marx was right about capitalism and these instabilities and these problems. And so there's some redemption in that idea, which is let's carve a better future by figuring out, what state capacity that we have, what it can do, and then let's adjust capitalism to those ends. So they're very much in line with the idea that's not just Marxist, but this idea that technocrats can plan good outcomes in society and we can successfully follow their kind of plans and get there. And so that's at the end, I thought, if you had said that I'm glad they didn't write that in the intro.
Yeah.
Because I would have been so, as an economist, thinking, I would have read it differently, maybe.
Yeah.
Having not had that at the beginning, I was more in the full roller coaster ride, which I enjoyed.
Yeah.
Because I thought, well, this is a thoughtful book. This is a thoughtful and provocative book. It's a difficult thing, I imagine, for them to say because you'd have to know what you just said is going to happen.
Yeah.
You're kind of opening yourself up to be attacked from all sides. But I think it's thoughtful in the sense that, so I was positive in the end, even with the Marx stuff. I said, look, this is a great book because it means that thoughtful people on the left are making a case that abundance, which includes material well-being and economic growth, is important. If we could just truly, as the right and the left, agree on that one point, I think we can do a lot.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people, particularly radical elements of the environmental movement, that are like degrowth. Economic growth itself is the enemy.
Down. Yep.
Material abundance is the enemy. Like we actually need, to solve climate change, we need a sort of general immiseration.
Yes, and it's a very scary proposition because if you believe that, then you are going to have to put somebody in charge to degrow the economy and to figure out who's going to have what. And so immediately now you're in the position of some sort of central planner. And so I think we also see this on the right, including the new right. Mm-hmm. And so, kind of the horseshoe theory of politics is realized in this anti-growth trend that we're seeing. And so, again, that's why I think the book is important. And maybe their point of view is that they write the book to, kind of raise more questions than it answers. And I think sometimes those are the best books because it means they're onto something. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. So you have this sort of technocratic paradigm that they seem unable to let go of. Like they see there's problems with many of the technocratic solutions that have been offered. They defend some of them still, clinging to them. What's the opposite? What would it look like for them to take economics seriously? For us to have a real abundance agenda? How do we get that yogurt commercial if we can't get it this way? How do we get that world of solar panels and drones delivering our pharmaceuticals? And yeah.
Such a great question for me, because I think this is what I want the book to be about, or at least the discussion that I want to come from the book, if I had my way. But at the end of the day, they are not economists. Now, I don't want to sound arrogant and to say, you can only write a policy book if you're an economist. But I do believe that they have some good ideas. They're right about certain regulations that have become entirely pernicious and are hurting people, and so we need to stop that. But because they don't fully employ the economic way of thinking, now they talk about externalities at times, and they do talk about unintended consequences, so you get this language of economics in there, but at the end of the day, they don't understand what you and I would understand when we talk about the knowledge problem, right? Which comes from F.A. Hayek, of course, but this idea that knowledge is decentralized. We don't know what the future holds. I would even argue that we don't know. The yogurt commercial might not be the right future. Maybe it is, but we don't know. I mean, we can make movies about the future, right? We can imagine, we can write novels about the future. And it would be fun to see, what ideas those people have come true. But I think that's what Hayek is talking about, is that not only in the here and now would a planner have to know exactly all the means available to do this thing, exactly all the preferences to do it, and exactly all the combination of inputs to get to set output. We can't do that even in the here and now, but let alone know what to invest in now for 50 years from now. And so the entrepreneurial process in an economy, I think, is the solution to the problem that they see rightly, but they don't see entrepreneurship enough as a role, as a feature of the market economy that can be trusted to deliver the innovations. Now, I'm not saying you don't need any regulations ever. I think you need the rule of law. I think you need the protection of private property rights. And I think in general, those are extremely effective at constraining firms, right? I think the search for profit and loss, profit rewards firms for doing things well that customers like. So that means those firms are creating value in the moment. But losses punish firms, right? And it gives them information about, we got to do this differently. So that's the problem with them, not fully understanding the economic way of thinking, and thus just not really being able to bring it into their analysis. Because if you don't see the world that way, then your questions about why don't we have better housing regulations, or why don't we have drones dropping off almost free prescription drugs, right? Prescription drugs, like if you have strep throat today and you need penicillin, you can get this, I think, for $0. Yeah. Or even if you don't have insurance, you can get it for very, very small amount of money. So that's amazing progress in spite of the enormous regulatory burdens we have. So I would like them to have a different type of imagination, which is to say, the counterfactual for them is, what if the state capacity argument is wrong? What if we had to ask the question, if we allowed more market productivity, entrepreneurship, recognizing the knowledge problem and recognizing the productive role of markets, what would that give us? So they don't really ask that question, because I don't think it's in their wheelhouse to ask that question.
Yeah. As you were reading this book, I was thinking, when I was reading your review and I was reading other reviews of this book, and when I was reading, I think Ezra Klein wrote like an essay that was sort of like a précis of the book for the New York Times. I thought about James Petacoucos's The Conservative Futurist, in which he lays out, he doesn't use this language, he talks about upwing and downwing imagination. He wants people to embrace dynamism in markets in order to deliver the sort of economic growth that America has seen in the past, particularly 50s, 60s levels of economic growth. He thinks that's possible if we hadn't have done some regulatory things. Have you read that book?
I have not read that book.
It's a fun
but I
book.
will.
It's
Yeah.
a very fun book, and he's very into science fiction and makes like a
Okay.
lot of great references. But when you were reading it, did you think of this? It begins with this exercise of the imagination. And now we've talked about what the book is lacking is actually it's a poverty of imagination. It's a failure to consider other possibilities. Did this read like a real vision for the future, or did it read like a sort of white paper to maybe shift, like, let's say, the Democratic Party platform or something like that? Was it, you have these books, and you have these books, they exist on all points of ideological spectrums and about all sorts of things that are like truly kind of works of imagination, presenting something unique, something new. Did it feel unique and new to you like that, or did it feel calculated, I guess is the question.
I'm going to answer that with a little bit of both.
Okay.
So I think it's captivating how they open it with, again, the vignette about the future. I think just using the language of abundance, which of course has to include economic development and growth, which someone like me and other, kind of like-minded people, we get excited about that. And because we understand that when you unleash the power of human creativity, look at what we've done in the world just in 200 years. It's remarkable. And I think we need to have a lot of intellectual humility about that. And so there's parts that I love and I'm optimistic about. And then there's, one of the things I said in my review is, how is the technocratic approach going to work this time, in italics? Yeah. Because it's not like this is a new idea. It's not like people haven't been complaining about regulations for a very long time. And I think this kind of, in some ways, is just old left, more conservative versus progressive arguments, which is, more versus less regulations. And I think what they're saying is smart regulations, which means well-planned regulations, which means we can know what the right ones are. I think in some areas they might be more willing to just say, these are NIMBY housing regulations, they're hurting everybody. And they celebrate the YIMBY response, right? Which they also say, this is also a grassroots response to, this is insane. Nobody can do anything. Nobody can build anything. You have these like sterile, hyper-planned communities, and not everybody wants that. Yeah. And so I think they see that is an appropriate response. So I guess my answer to that is a little bit of both. So some of it reads like, especially when they talk about climate change, this is, and I just want to go on the record to say it's not the case, or I never want to be heard as saying that climate change is like a non-issue and doesn't matter and we shouldn't care or something. But I think the onus is on people who are advocating for these sweeping changes to policy, spending, regulations in favor of protecting climate change and all this type of stuff. The burden is on them to tell us about the cost-benefit analysis. And so often they don't do that at all. And they didn't do that in this book. I would like for someone to explain what they mean when they say climate change, right? So define your terms. What do you mean? Are you worried about CO2? Are you worried about specifically global warming? Are you worried about fossil fuels? Maybe you're worried about all that and more. I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but even more important, right? For somebody like me reading it, what do you mean? What do you want to change? But and at what cost? So economists always have to ask that question. At what cost and what are the alternatives? And so I think generally people on the left assume that there are no alternatives to effective climate change than using the government to intervene in markets, which changes patterns of production, it raises prices, and it's absolutely used by insiders to prohibit outsiders. So Bruce Yandel, economist emeritus now at Clemson in the 70s, worked for the Federal Trade Commission, and he wrote a piece called The Bootleggers and Baptist Theory of Regulation, right? So there's that all over the place with climate change. Now, I don't expect them necessarily to know about bootleggers and Baptists, but I think as an economist reading it, and they're writing about economic policy, I think that they have a burden to go a little farther to do that cost-benefit analysis. And you really can't do the cost-benefit analysis if you don't define what you're talking about. What are we trying to achieve? And so in that sense, some of it read a little ideologically for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That they just don't question. You need climate change. Okay, well, what is that? And what does that mean? Does it mean going back to their vignette where like I only consuming local water? That seems really expensive. I don't know what that means or how we would get that or how I'm going to get plant-based meat. I mean, what if people don't want plant-based meat? The market takes account of these things. And actually the market, I talk to my students about this all the time, because the market exists in a system of private property rights. Entrepreneurs they're not incentivized to only make money today, right? So if you sell cows for meat and milk and butter and all this type of stuff, you don't just use up all your cows in 2025. You kind of have a life cycle. Yeah. And you have to think about breeding cows into the future. This is true if you have forestry. If you're chopping down trees to make pencils, then you have to have regrowth of trees. And so you have these baked-in incentives via a private property rights system to think about the future. And I think the environmental concerns that are quite legitimate require private property rights solutions because that induces us to think about the future. And so there's none of that kind of discussion because I think they're very wary. They would view that maybe as free market fundamentalism or something.
Yeah. Is this better or worse than the median American journalistic discussion of these issues? Because part of this is might be just a failure of expertise and people writing about something that you really, really need an economics background to understand, and they don't have that background. That's not their professional background. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more sophisticated than, for example, if they were to write a series of blog posts. So it is more sophisticated. They do talk, they do references and they cite some literature. But I think at a fundamental level, they're unable to ask those two important economic questions. What are the alternatives of doing this thing, and what's the cost? And so if they had even, consulted an economist to read some of this, maybe they would have asked different questions. And so that's where I think part of it is exciting as a book because, again, I think on the right, we're also seeing this anti-growth language. Yeah. And you have people like Orrin Cass arguing that life was better for Americans in the 1970s and 50s, which is, I don't know how to say it nice. That's insane.
Yeah.
There's absolutely nothing that is convincing about that argument, either emotionally or empirically. And one other thing I wanted to bring up as I was thinking about your question when you were asking it is, in the back of my mind, I have this book called Superabundance.
Okay.
By Marian Tupy and Gail Pooley, two economists. And so superabundance is a story of not only do we live in abundant times, but we experience superabundance. And that is driven by having lots of really productive people on the planet. So it's a very Julian Simon-based argument, right? People are the only possessors of human capital. Those people need economic freedom. When we have economic freedom, you get superabundance, which is that as the population grows, the price, the time price, in other words, how much you have to work to get the thing, goes down. So if you compare those two books, and I'm just doing it based on title, but they're dealing with similar topics, right? I look at superabundance, and it's very, very compelling because it's economists who are using empirical metrics about the time prices of commodities and tracking them over time and able to present a case that, this is how much cheaper all these things are, whether it's a washing machine or anything, cars, anything else. That is a much more technical argument. I think Ezra and Thompson, Ezra Klein and Thompson just can't do that work. And so it's a different type of book, but it's really interesting for me to read those simultaneously because they're kind of getting at the same thing.
Yeah.
But very different ways. And I think actually one leads to maybe less growth. I think if we listen to Klein and Thompson, you're probably not going to get a lot more growth. I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of what's depressing about it, right? It's like, it's just another state capacity argument. We've been through this 1,000 times, and it just relies on these state and city planners to have knowledge they're never going to have, and the right incentives.
Yeah.
And maybe some benevolence thrown in, right? Whereas Tupy and Pooley's argument is, no, you need private property rights, no, and it can be imperfect. So even in a country like the United States, it's not like this economic freedom is perfect, but you get a lot of growth. You've historically got a lot of growth. And what retards that growth is the regulations themselves.
If we think about Klein and Thompson are animated by a positive vision for the future, and we brought up Orrin Cass here, and some of the new right folks who have a positive vision of the past that might be equally as illusory as the sort of yogurt commercial future that Klein and Thompson are talking about. Do you see these as similar misunderstand? I mean, the one is sort of a nostalgia, the other is a sort of fantasy. But I think they've come up a couple of times, and I think there is a sort of similar track that they look around and they see a policy landscape or a world in which it doesn't seem to have delivered what everybody hoped, that the policy landscape that's currently in place has let them down. And, for the American Compass folks, it has like been letting us down for a long time, and it's been getting worse and worse and worse and worse. What sort of mistakes are they making? I mean, we've talked about, there's just the mistakes of historical fact. That, as anybody who lived in the 1970s can tell you, life was not better in the 1970s. Certainly, Detroit Tigers fans in 1968, it was better for Tigers fans in 1968. Although we have a pretty good team this year. But most things that are measured in superabundance, we're clearly in a better place. Where do you think this misplaced nostalgia is coming from? Are they mistaken, or is it cynical? So this gets back to, maybe this is the similarity, because, the Cass and the American Compass folks have gotten a lot of pushback. I reviewed Michael Lynn's Hell to Pay for Law and Liberty. It has all sorts of the same sort of issues. Are the facts beside the point for them? Is it cynical, or is it just a failure to understand?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people debate that. It's perplexing in this regard. So you have Klein and Thompson, who are admittedly on the left.
Yeah.
Advocating for like planned abundance. Maybe I could say it that way, right? Like planned abundance, but abundance. And then you have Cass et al., which are funded by people on the left.
Yes.
But are advocating for like some sort of redefining of conservatism. Now, Cass would tell you that this is true conservatism. His vision is true conservatism. And here's the thing. He's a Harvard-trained lawyer. He is not stupid. He is not an economist, despite what he says. I think this is a quest for power and control. I think it comes from maybe a different direction. So I think Klein and Thompson get to speak to elites on the left, but they're journalists. I'm not sure they're vying for political influence directly, right? Like want to be in somebody's cabinet or something.
Yeah.
I think Cass is. I think Cass is very influential in the White House today, to some extent, at least with J.D. Vance. So I think it's a power move. I think politicians maintain power by convincing you to be afraid of things. Because if things are going great, if the economy's developing nicely, if we don't have a lot of war, if, there's like not the threat of terrorism, it's like, well, what are they going to sell you? It's harder to sell non-fear-based government programs. But if the fear is that you're losing, it's kind of like losing your religion, right? It's like, and that's what Cass is saying. And there are other people who've talked about this besides him, but it's this idea that we're like somehow being turned into radical individualists. It's the bowling alone stuff, right? It's like nobody sits on their front porch anymore. Nobody's in bowling clubs, and everybody's online and playing video games, and we're going to be taken over by all this kind of stuff that I actually think there are some concerns about living in a digital world in terms of friendships and relationships that maybe we didn't have in 1950. Like in 1950, everybody went to church on Sunday. There's something good about that, right? Across racial lines, people went to church together. Across income lines, people went to church together. And so there's problems, there's issues sociologically, I think, that we need to think about. But to somehow say that anti-growth is the way to kind of like return to the 1950s.
Which was a very high growth time in the American economy.
Which is ironic because that's not what they point to, right? It's like more traditional conservative family life, less divorce, all this type of stuff. So they're looking at some of those types of things. And I don't think Orrin Cass can separate like divorce rates or marriage rates or drug addiction or whatever from how he thinks about economic growth. So for him, capitalism is the villain. Capitalism has literally like alienated us from ourselves, which sounds a little Marxist to me, right? So, but if you are an advocate of capitalism, you necessarily believe in a small, limited government. You have to because you can't believe in a large, overreaching, bloated government. And so I think he has to do this to get what he wants. And it seems to me in the short run he wants political influence at least. Yeah. And so I'm just kind of being a public choice economist about it, although it sounds very cynical. Yeah. But I don't actually think, I don't think Orrin Cass, who lives in the suburbs of Massachusetts, has a Harvard law degree, types away on his laptop every day, wants to go back to 1970 when there were no laptops. So like when you push people in that corner of this is what you would have to give up, they want no part of it. Yeah. They want no part of 1970s prices. And again, I think it's a very technocratic approach to how you view the world as a chessboard with pieces. They're passive players, and you want to move them around.
So this is a way. This calls us back to Adam Smith's Man of System.
Yes,
and I love the alternative that Smith proposes, which is the Man of Public Spirit, which is interesting because it's not ideological in the opposite direction. It is rather somebody who seeks to persuade. They seek to represent the electorate, even in ways that the electorate is wrong, but seeks to persuade them of a better, more free direction. And I guess I wonder if part of the problem with when we talk about spontaneous order and we talk about how the economy works and we talk about how we don't know what the ideal future is, part of what following those arguments means is you have to give up belief in a sort of utopian future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You interviewed my teacher, mentor, Peter Betke, earlier, and this is his mantra in graduate school, when he was training us and he says it to everyone, but this is kind of this is how I was trained is economics puts parameters on our utopias. Rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. And that is a very counterintuitive set of ideas. People want to believe that we're in control of everything, that we can imagine this world and create it in our own image. And economics is about those constraints. And as Thomas Sowell, of course, said, the first lesson of economics is scarcity. And the first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. So I think whether you're talking about Orrin Cass or Bernie Sanders, or it doesn't matter on the progressive left or the new right, that's a debate that's hard to win for people in the tradition of Smith and classical liberalism, right? It's because it's about believing in this decentralized system that actually puts a lot of disciplinary kind of incentives and functions on people to kind of think about not just their own interests, but the common good, right?
Yeah.
And that this kind of idea of cosmopolitanism, where we can coexist and live among each other in this kind of democratic society, but have different beliefs, have different religions, have, different values and things like this, that actually, I believe, requires also a limited democratic government, right? And so I think some of these problems that are, at least on a superficial level, addressed by the book go back to, 125 years of looking at how the U.S. has changed so dramatically in terms of the size and the scope of government. And when you do that, the fights become more and more, the political fights become more vicious over time because you're battling for the control of the turf, right? They're all turf wars. Politics is a zero-sum game, and markets aren't. Orrin Cass does not believe that markets are a positive-sum game. And I don't think Klein and Thompson believe markets are a positive-sum game. But when you read them, you actually see a little bit more tolerance at times of markets than you see from Orrin Cass, who claims he's a conservative. And then I think, okay, how would I compare Orrin Cass to Ronald Reagan? Right? Like this, there's just not a lot of similarities. And Ronald Reagan, of course, I use that example because he was an ardent defender of free markets and global liberalism and, of course, kind of anti-Marxist and things like this.
So I'm wondering, one of the things we haven't talked about in terms of the Klein and Thompson book is if there is any sort of religious angle or any sort of addressing of religion at all in it. I'm not sure of Thompson and Klein's religious backgrounds. They work for secular publications. I believe Derek Thompson works for the Atlantic Monthly, and Ezra Klein is with the New York Times. Did they ever approach religion at all?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Not to my memory at all. So if it was, kind of a sentence or something. But no, I don't.
Any other discussion of civil society? Anything beyond sort of the individual and the state?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question because that is lacking, which is if you think about how healthcare was provided in the United States prior to the 19th and 20th centuries, it is a Tocquevillian story. It is a story of these intermediating institutions that form from, Tocqueville says, religious freedom, right? Is that people are free in the public square to live out their conscience. So what do? They develop orphanages. They develop hospitals. They care for widows. They do all these kind of educational, kind of ventures. And so he sees this as so robust, not only because it's very different from his France, right, which he's comparing it to, but that those institutions act as a buffer against the growth of the state. So there's no discussion of that really in the book. And I think that's, again, I'm not sure in general how modern progressives view civil society. I mean, do they view it as an extent of the state? I think in the classical liberal tradition, we would argue that it's its own spontaneous order, and it's a set of institutions that's absolutely essential, but that it has a really productive role to play to solve some of the problems they're worried about.
Yeah.
So if you're worried about healthcare, if you're worried about housing, these are things that civil society took care of before we had this kind of massive bureaucratic government. The other thing is that I think the importance for classical liberals to kind of bring civil society into the discussion as well as with the new right is that I think that civil society allows us to experiment. And I think markets do as well. But they also allow us to be more nimble. If we're engaging in some local social project or program and it's not working, you have the ability to change what you're doing rather quickly. And I think that's something that outside of not having a discussion about civil society in their book, I think they just don't see that as a possibility for getting their agenda accomplished. What if there's this robust civil society taking care of some of these problems? Maybe we need a civil society, civic organization that offers boarding houses. That's one way to think about it. So I'm just not sure that's in their framework of how they think about the world. So that's not really something they focus on.
Anne, thank you so much for reading this book. It's a big book.
Yeah.
And it was a roller coaster ride, and we're glad to have you bring your expertise to bear on it. And this has been a delightful conversation, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.